it gives me great pleasure to welcome Matthew Mitchell, who will be sharing with us on the Four Horsemen. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Charlotte. My name is Matthew, and I have alcoholism, and it's such an AA occurrence to be on this meeting. I had it written on my calendar for 3 o'clock this afternoon, UK meeting, and I thought, why would they have a meeting at 11 o'clock at night in the UK? I just was finishing another meeting. I had no phone number, no idea what I was doing, and Charlotte called and said, can you jump on the meeting right now? And I just found out what the topic was right when she just said it. So those four horsemen are terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. And for everyone counting days, Stephen, GP, Irma, Caroline, George, Steve, Tim, I know that you're close to that. You know, my good friend Ralph White said very perfectly one day years ago, I wasn't running towards the light, I was running from the fire when I got to AA. And that's true for me. My sobriety date's May 16th, 1993. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 30 years old, and now I'm 60 years old. So I've been sober as long as I was alive when I arrived here. And I think there's so much benefit from staying close to the program of AA. I often get frustrated, and for many years I have, when I've been at meetings and I hear people say, I'm 20 years sober, but I come for the newcomer. Great. I come for me, man. You know, the newcomer is certainly an opportunity for me to grow. You know, there's a phrase in English, at least in American English, you guys are the real English speakers over there, but it's, you know, we extended ourselves. I extended myself to give somebody my phone number. I extended myself to sponsor somebody. I extended myself to take a commitment. And in the truest literal sense, I extended myself. I got larger. I got bigger. I got relief for a little while from terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. When I glanced down at what those were after Charlotte mentioned that that's what I'd be talking about today, I immediately thought about early sobriety, right? Or actually pre-early sobriety, before I got to AA. But certainly my first year of AA was really, really racked with terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. And for me to be qualify for those of you who I named off who were counting days, you know, 30 years ago, I couldn't stop drinking. I couldn't stop drinking, and I didn't like drinking anymore. I couldn't stop drinking, and I'd been alone in my apartment for 6 months. I couldn't stop drinking when my electricity got shut off. I couldn't stop drinking when that 18-year-old girl told 30-year-old me she was pregnant. I couldn't stop drinking when I lost my job. I couldn't stop drinking when I pushed that pregnant girl down a flight of stairs. No matter how morally corrupt I continued to get because of my alcoholism, I couldn't stop it, and I wanted to stop it. And when I look at those days before I got sober and the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, for me, my experience, one of the biggest concepts that I got introduced to probably 3-4 months in, when my sponsor said, hey, we're going to kneel down on my floor in our kitchen here, and we're going to do the third step. We're going to kneel down and hold hands, and I'm going to say part of this prayer, and you're going to recite it. And then I'm going to say some more of the prayer, and you're going to recite it. And I'm everything in me says I'm not going to get down on my knees and hold hands with this strange man in his kitchen. I did not know that I asked, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer to be my sponsor, you know, or for you guys in the UK, the Yorkshire Ripper to be my sponsor. I'm not getting on the ground with a guy and holding hands and saying this prayer. But we knelt down on the floor, and he held my hands, and he was this close to me, and he said, God, I offer myself to thee. And I said, God, I offer myself to thee. And he said, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. And I said, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. And he said, relieve me of the bondage of self. And I said, oh my God, really? Can I get relief from the bondage of self? And I said those words, relieve me of the bondage of self. And then he said that I might better do thy will. And when I'm in the bondage of self, my perspective on the world comes from the place of, we call it in AA, 100 forms of fear, or terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. So in my first beginning of sobriety, I didn't have a job. I had a baby that was born the day I got sober. I had to move in with my parents at 30 years old, and my mother was dying of cancer. And my father was beside himself that he was going to lose the love of his life. And their loser son, me, was in the bedroom down the hall, trying to go to meetings and get crappy jobs and do one thing in front of the next. And I didn't get relief of bondage of self by getting days of sobriety. I got some health. I got some opportunities to get a job, and then some opportunities to get another job just by not drinking. And being in the fellowship that I happened to walk into, I was pretty insulated from drinking. I went to meetings every day, but I didn't get relief from terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair because I was still in the bondage of self. I used to walk into AA meetings, and it seemed like the only chair available was the one across the room, and I'm so self-conscious. I'd pour myself a cup of coffee, then spill it all the way across the room. And I'm sure you're all looking at me and talking about me, and for Stephen and GB and Irma and Caroline and George and Steve and Tim, we're not looking at you. We're not thinking about you. You just landed in the epicenter of self-centeredness on earth. You landed in Alcoholics Anonymous. We might be resting our eyes on you while we self-obsess about whatever it is we're thinking about ourselves today. And if there does happen to be someone in the room who's looking at you and thinking about you, that's called grace. That's somebody getting relief from the bondage of self by saying, there's a new guy, there's a new girl, I'm going to get him a cup of coffee. And when they walk across the room and they hand you a cup of coffee, you can't believe someone's looking at you and talking about you. You get a little relief. Well, I was like 60 days sober, living at my parents' house. I had this terrible job stacking newspapers out in a loading dock from midnight to 4 a.m. for minimum wage. And I have 2 degrees, I have 2 college degrees, and that's the best I could do. And I walked into a Starbucks, which was a bold move at that time because $4 for a cup of coffee was like the money I had for the day. And I remember I walked up and they said, "What's your name?" for the order. And I said, "My name's Matthew." And I got to the other side of the Starbucks where they put the order out. And I'm standing there shaking from self-consciousness, thinking everyone's staring at me and talking about me. And I walk up to pick up my cup, and it says on the cup, "Your name's Matthew, and you have 60 days of sobriety." Because the person behind the counter had enough relief from the bondage of self, and they were going to meetings and watching me. And they handed me this cup, and I wasn't alone. And I thought I was that second. And I got this cup, and I looked over the counter, and this guy waved at me, and I recognized him from the meeting. He knew how many days I had. I had a little break from terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair because of the love of another human being. And when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was a study in self-centeredness. When that teenage girl walked up to me, she was a waitress at a restaurant I was managing very badly. And she walked up to me and she said, "I'm pregnant." She was 18. I was 30 years old. And I thought, not you. You're selfish and self-centered. That's how sick I was. I had just derailed this girl's life. And I thought, oh my God, I can't have a child with you. You're a spoiled Southern California girl. That's how sick I was. When that baby was born on May 16th of 1993, I'd woken up from a blackout. I'd passed out on the floor and got a call that she was born. And I raced to the wrong hospital. I drove to the hospital where I was born because that's where babies come from. I'm selfish and self-centered. I went to the wrong hospital, right? I'm yelling at the poor candy striper lady, and she's like, "You can get as mad as you want, sir. They're not here," right? But do you know how I felt in that hospital? I felt despair. I felt despair because I thought, I must be the world's biggest loser if I can't even go to the right hospital the day my child is born. And then I went out to the car and I put my head on the steering wheel and I felt terror. I was afraid to meet that girl. I don't want my mother to die of cancer, and I don't want to go to rehab today. And this was the day they were going to come get me. I was full of terror and bewilderment. And I laid my head on that steering wheel of that car and I turned the ignition and the car coughed. Like, it didn't just backfire, it jumped. I hadn't driven it in months, but I drove it to the wrong hospital. And my head bounced off the steering wheel and the name of the hospital, of the right hospital, came into my head. And Carol's heard me talk about this a lot. That is grace. By definition, that is grace. So Stephen and Steve and Tim and Irma and Caroline, et cetera, et cetera. You can't see it, but there's grace all around you. And I know there's grace happening in your life today because you're sitting here in this meeting. Stephen, you're back. George, you're back. GB, you're fresh out of rehab. Irma, you've got a couple of months. This is happening. There's grace happening. You know how you know it's grace? Because you couldn't do it before. You couldn't stop before. And I know it's grace that that hospital came into my head because I meditate. It's one of the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's one of the ways I get relief from the bondage of self and therefore relief from the four horsemen. And if you ever try to meditate for even a week, for 5 minutes a day, I've done it 19 years, 20 minutes day and night. But if you try to do it for a week, for 5 minutes a day, one of the first things you realize is, wow, I do not appear to be in charge of the thoughts that come into my head. They just keep coming in. I'm trying to meditate. And all of a sudden I'm thinking about the girl that wouldn't go to the dance with me when I was 17, or I'm thinking, did I pay my taxes? Or, your brain just gets flooded with thoughts. These are involuntary electrical impulses happening in my gray matter. And I put my head on that car wheel, deciding to go home and kill myself because I was so afraid. And when the car coughed, the name of the hospital came into my head. I wasn't trying to think of the name of the hospital. That's grace. By the definition of the laws of physics, that's grace. I had an involuntary electrical impulse that saved my life. I drove immediately to the right hospital because I was living in what my sponsor calls my lizard brain. And your lizard brain just runs from one event to the next without thinking about it. And I ran to the hospital in my car. I ran up the stairs and I ran in to that hospital room. And there's this girl that last time I saw her, I had pushed her down a flight of stairs. And she was glad to see me. And she starts coming towards me and I feel ugly. I smell bad. I feel disgusting. I'm embarrassed that she's glad to see me. And she stops in front of me and she reaches into this box and she pulls out this baby named Phoebe Rose. And she hands Phoebe to me. And I look at her and she is so beautiful and so perfect. And I wanted to throw up because my head was on fire with the four horsemen. I was terrified. I was bewildered. I was frustrated. And I was in the throes of despair. And all I could think of was, I got to get out of here. They're beautiful and I'm ugly. And I handed that baby back to Anna and I lied. I said, everything's going to be all right. And I relaxed because I knew I had the courage to shoot myself. There was a gun at my house. I put it in my mouth many times and I never pulled the trigger, but I relaxed because I didn't have to deal with this world that Anna and Phoebe lived in was where 2 + 2 = 4. This world they lived in, there looked to be a new authenticity about Anna, a new beauty around her eyes, a new presence in her. She was a mother. And this baby was just purity. And I didn't even live on that planet. And I didn't know then what I know now because I consistently apply the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous to my life for 30 years, as I was in the bondage of self. I could only see them through the lens of What does this mean to me? How does this affect me? What is my responsibility here? And I remembered when I saw Anna that I pushed her down the stairs. I had forgotten because I walked right back in my apartment and got drunk that day. And I looked at them and I could only see them through the pinhole of light in the metal box around my head called the bondage of self. And when you're in the bondage of self, life itself will fill you with terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. And when I got home, I ran up the stairs to get that gun because it was going to all be over in a minute. And my brother was standing on my porch with a duffel bag full of my clothes. And he said, I packed your stuff, get in the car. That's grace. We're swimming in it. It's all around us. Think about that timing. I had driven to the wrong hospital. I had driven to the right hospital. I had spent less than 2 minutes in the presence of my child. I had run down the stairs of that hospital and floored it home. And in that time, my brother had shown up to take me. I knew he was coming, and I wasn't there. He'd let himself in the apartment. He'd packed my stuff, and he was walking out when I walked in. That, to me, by the laws of physics, is grace. A lot of people come here and they use the God thing to keep them away from the recovery thing. When I sponsor people, I always say, I don't care at all what you think about God, but we're going to talk a lot about grace. And it doesn't matter. You can call it the animating force. You know, like we think about, you know, I love it when we learn that we're powerless, right? First step is just a universal spiritual truth. It's not an AA discovery. It's a universal spiritual truth. Of myself, I am nothing. It's said in every faith, even in Buddhism. I am powerless, right? And my life is unmanageable. I love it when somebody says to me when they're 2 years sober, like, you know, I still can't seem to manage my life. And I just burst out laughing. I go, of course not. It's life. It's too big to manage, man. You're not supposed to manage it. You're invited to it. You're supposed to show up. But man, if I'm thinking I got to manage my life, then I've got a little bit of the bondage of self. If I got the bondage of self and I'm looking at how big life is, I'm going to be filled with terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. There's no other route. But if I realize that I'm powerless, but I'm not worthless, I'm powerless, but I'm precious, I'm powerless, but I'm responsible for the power, then I got a place to go. And the obvious place is, where's this freaking power? And one of the places that they point in AA is, there's a power greater than you. Can you be willing to admit that? And I look at I sit in a beautiful room. I have a beautiful office I sit in my house. Outside the window are beautiful trees. There's oak trees and palm trees and pine trees. Palm trees, I live in California, right? And those trees are exhaling every second of every day what I'm inhaling. Without those trees, I would fall over dead at this chair. For me to think I'm powerful and I have volition is ridiculous. 10 million things had to happen biologically, physically, and in the earth for me to get out of bed today. You know, so I don't care what you think of God. Let's talk about grace, right? And then when I start to realize the interconnectedness of my life, I get relieved of the bondage of self, and terror turns down. The volume on the terror turns down. The volume, I'm not bewildered anymore. You know, I learned something in Alcoholics Anonymous, and this might mean a lot to you, Tim and Steve and George B. and Caroline and Irma and Stephen and GB. There's a lot of fear when you're new, and there's a lot of fear before you're new. But let's talk about the fear when you're new. You know, when I got sober, I fell in love with a girl from Wales. She's from Cardiff. She works for British Airways. Met her at the airport, fell in love with this girl. Love at first sight. We got engaged in 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks we got engaged. We've been married for 27 years. I adore her. When she says the word water, the way a lot of you people say it, I propose again. Because I'm from freaking California, man. We say water. I like water. Can you give me a drink of water? I just think she's amazing. She's mystical. She's magical. My wife is beautiful. She looks like Audrey Hepburn. And when I was newly sober, I fell in love. I was 2 years sober. I got married. Everybody came. And 5 years after that, my wife had a massive stroke. And she became paralyzed. And she became brain damaged. That was 22 years ago. And I still feel like the luckiest guy on earth. And I was driving down the street when I had a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and Phoebe was 8. And Philip is paralyzed. And I'm new at my job. And I called my sponsor, and he didn't answer. So I called my sponsor's sponsor, because I was being driven by 100 forms of fear, which is terror. I called my sponsor's sponsor, and I go, I'm a terrible husband. I'm a terrible worker. My kids have got a shitty father. This just isn't going to work out. And he laughed. He laughed out loud. I wasn't new. I was 5 or 7 years sober. And he said, look, let's pretend for just a minute that you're not in charge. And then I started laughing. Oh yeah, I'm not in charge. I got relief from the bondage of self, the misperception that I'm supposed to run everybody's life and fix everybody's world. First lesson in fear, you're not in charge. The second thing I'll never forget that he said to me, he said, Matthew, fear is the false belief that you will not have the resources you need to meet the challenges of the present moment. I'm going to say that again. Fear is the false belief that you will not have the resources you need to meet the challenges of the present moment. And he said, you know it's a false belief because you're 37 years old. So for 37 years, you've had the resources you've needed to meet the challenges of every single present moment. We believe that, yeah, but the thing that's going to happen tomorrow, I won't have the resources. Now, does my life look like I thought it was going to? I didn't expect to be my wife's caregiver. I married the hottest chick I'd ever met. I married the smartest person I ever knew. And that all changed. And I found out I married the person that I'm in love with, the human soul that I'm connected to. And we are very happy together. So fear was the false belief I wouldn't be able to handle it. Well, I wouldn't have been able to handle it if I had to handle it all at once. But time is so everything doesn't happen at the same moment, and space is so everything doesn't happen to me. So I got to go through the day and accept things as they go. And the last thing I want to say about fear, because it's the bewilderment part of these 4 horsemen, is from a book I read by Bo Lazoff. And he just describes it so beautifully. You know, you guys are in the UK. My wife is from Wales. Picture a coal miner, right? Coal miner goes down into a coal mine. If he's 100 feet into that coal mine, or however many meters that is, there's danger behind him. But he's not thinking about that. In front of him, it can go down there 2 miles. There's unspeakable, unknowable danger in front of him. But he's not thinking about that because on his helmet is a bright spotlight. And wherever is right in front of him, he sees all the elements that prepare him to know how to take care of what needs to be taken care of at that moment. He gets all the information he needs to be calm and centered and handle the situation at hand. And that's what life is like. When I get driven by 100 forms of fear, I predict a dark future, everything crashing and burning, right? That's not how it happens. I work in oncology. I work for a biotech company. I sit in waiting rooms with cancer patients. I stand in infusion centers with cancer patients. My wife has got different illnesses, right? And what happens when you get the news that you have cancer is you immediately picture a painful death. Well, that's not what cancer means anymore. So what happens is you get that news, you absorb that news, and you wake up the next day. And it's just another day. It's sunny out. The trees are exhaling. you're inhaling. You might go to a doctor's appointment. You might talk to your kids, your wife about your illness. And you have the information you need to handle the situation that's happening right then. And a lot of times you don't die of cancer, but you spend the first 2 days thinking, I got cancer, I'm going to die. I got alcoholism. Alcoholism is a terminal illness. I've done 4 eulogies for people who died of alcoholism in the last 30 years. But I've done 7 weddings for people who've recovered from alcoholism. Because in the moment, you know what to do. I met my wife at a bus stop. I was bowled over by her beauty and her intelligence. And on the bus stop, we talked. And after the bus ride, I asked her if she'd go out with me. And she said, no. She said, absolutely not. You know, it was not apparently the next indicated thing. And the next day I met her at the bus stop again. We worked at airlines. She worked at British Airways. I worked at Qantas. And I turned to her and she said, I'm sorry, I think I was rude yesterday. And I said, that's okay. And she said, I don't want to go out with you. And I said, you've been very clear about that. I know you don't. You don't have to. And she said, let's have coffee. And it was, I knew what to do. My headlight on my helmet said, go have coffee. And we sat and we talked. And we missed all the buses to our employee bus stop. And we had to take a cab. And the next day we just had coffee again. And the next day we had coffee again. And 2 weeks later, she turned to me and said, I have a silly question to ask you. And I said, what's that? And she said, have you been waiting for this your whole life? I said, yes, ma'am, I have. And she said, will you marry me? And I said, absolutely. It was 27 years ago. I didn't think, oh shit, get married, my life is over. I'll never have sex again. You know, all the things that men think when they're 20. I toured all over the world as a lead guitar player of a rock and roll band. I knew what I was about to start missing, and I couldn't wait to be married to Philippa. And it's never let us down. And we've had a lot of stuff come at us. My son checked himself into a hospital on suicide watch. And because I do the 11th step and I meditate, I didn't drive the 2 hours to that mental hospital on the ego trip of guilt. I didn't drive to that mental hospital thinking I'm a bad dad. What did I do wrong? I drove to that mental hospital repeating the name of God. And when I walked into that mental hospital, I didn't think I got to say exactly the right thing. I got to change him. I got to show him that dad knows best. He came out of his room. He saw me and he was glad to see me. I was glad to see him. And I held him for the longest time. And I realized all I have to offer him is my presence. All I have to offer him is my openness. And my son, that was 8 years ago, is a picture of mental health. He is a loving, kind man. And I'm powerless over that, but I'm not worthless. And I'm going to finish with this because I think I just have a minute left. Oh, I have 5 minutes left. These things, this terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. We have these 12 elegant spiritual exercises that relieve us of the bondage of self. You know, I don't avoid uncomfortable situations anymore. I used to think, oh, it might be uncomfortable for me at that party. I'm not going to go. Oh, I might, if I go to the beach, it might get cold. That's uncomfortable. I'm not going to go. I used to do that. You know what? You can't be a good husband if you avoid uncomfortable situations, period. You can't be a good parent if you avoid uncomfortable situations. I can't be a good worker. I can't be a good friend. I can't be a good friend to myself if I avoid uncomfortable situations. But I have 12 spiritual tools. So I can go into those uncomfortable situations and know whatever happens, I'm going to be all right. Whatever happens, I'm going to be able to bring the fruits of my experience. This program is a perfect spiritual community. And I know that because I have a degree in religious studies and another degree in English literature. So I'm qualified to like work at a drugstore. But if the religious community It's a religious community because we don't care about material things here. I don't care if you're famous or infamous. I don't care if you're rich or poor. The only currency that we have in Alcoholics Anonymous is our experience. And I align myself with people. One of my sponsees and I were speaking on a meeting just before this one. And that guy, I've been sponsoring him for 25 years. He's a very famous musician. He turns towards the challenge. He turns toward the uncomfortable situation. I go to him for wisdom because if you actually live out the prayer of the serenity prayer, God grant me the serenity, the spiritual centeredness, the calm in the storm, to accept the things I can't change, life on life's terms, the courage to change the things I can, to go toward the uncomfortable situation. You will automatically get the wisdom to know the difference. If you turn towards things, if you accept things, if you welcome this beautiful invitation to live life and not manage it, the byproduct is wisdom. I am surrounded by wise women and wise men. I love my life. It is objectively good. And I'm so grateful that you got a hold of me, Charlotte. I'm sorry if I'm a little wound up. I had way too much coffee today and I haven't eaten anything since I woke up. Thanks for letting me share.